Welcome to the Group Dentistry Now show, the voice of the DSO industry. Kim Larson and Bill Newman talk to industry leaders about their challenges, successes, and the future of group dentistry. Visit groupdentistrynow.com for more DSO analysis, news, and events. Looking for a job or have a job to fill? Visit joindso.com. We hope you enjoy today's show.
And I'd like to welcome everyone to the Group Dentistry Now show. I'm Bill Newman, and in this episode of Group Dentistry Now, we're going to be talking all things technology in the DSO space. So we have two technology experts that are well known and have been in the industry for quite a while, and actually outside the industry in technology. So we have Tom Barberio, and Tom he's the CIO of Thinc. So Tom, welcome.
Thank you, Bill. Pleasure.
And then we also have Dave Danielson, and he is the Senior Product Manager at Schein. So Dave, welcome.
Thank you. Welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Yep. Thanks, both of you guys, for being here. I'll give some introductions, give you a little bit of their background, and they can talk a little bit about their organizations that they work for and represent. So let's focus on Tom first. So Tom is the CIO of Thinc, and Thinc works with many DSOs in the industry. And Tom can get into that a little bit more. One of them in particular is Eastern Dental. He'll talk a little bit about that organization and their geography and how large they are and some of the other groups that they work with. So Tom has 18 years experience in delivering technology solutions in a variety of industries. So not just dental's one of them, but medical, financial services, pharmaceuticals, and IT consulting. Broad industry experience in many different size organizations, from Fortune 500 all the way down to Fortune 100 companies. His dental experience is really interesting and vast. So system design and integration, DSO build-outs, DSO M&A, de novo build-outs, IT and executive leadership, digital radiography integration, and IT process and change management. Tom has a BS and a master's degree in computer science and info technology. So let's talk a little bit about Dave's background. So Dave, again, is the Senior Product Manager at Schein. He has 20 years experience in software and technology. He's worked for companies like Symantec Corporation, Panasonic North America, Control4, really to improve products and services that drive amazing results. He, again, is a Senior Product Manager for Schein, specifically for Dentrix Enterprise, passionate about improving dental group practices, velocity and growth, and effectiveness. Dave's education includes a master's in business administration from Brigham Young University and undergrad at Utah Valley University. What a mouthful, both of you, both vast experience. So I'm really, again, happy to have you here. I think our listeners are really going to get quite a bit out of this. So why don't we start with Tom? Tom, tell us a little bit about the organizations that you work for.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Bill. So what we primarily do is we provide a pretty large suite of technology services, from everything in the executive consulting space, CIO outsource consulting space, all the way down through integration services down to the help desk level. Primarily, we work with a lot of large size and mid-size DSOs. That's kind of a little bit of a relative term nowadays. Mid-size DSOs can range from 5, upwards of 65 to 100 locations. And then we have larger DSOs that have several hundred locations. And we've done a lot of integration, consulting services, getting them really into the current century and making a change. DSOs have done a lot of technology upgrades and changes in the last 3 to 5 years, and it's the landscape's a lot different than it was. And now, we'll talk more about that a little later, but it's always evolving.
Yeah, and I'm sure during this COVID crisis, the pandemic, with shutting practices down and then reopening them and in different stages, and possibly, if you're over different states, that process, which we'll talk a lot about. Well, thanks, Tom, for the background. We mentioned one of the DSOs that you work with is Eastern Dental.
Correct. Yes, Eastern Dental's a fairly large, multifaceted DSO practice, primarily East Coast based in the state of New Jersey, but they're more on your larger size DSOs, some very large practices that running specialties as well as managed care and other services out of that.
Great. Okay, Dave, you're up. So let's talk a little bit about Henry Schein One. I think just about everybody probably listening or watching this podcast knows Henry Schein. Let's talk a little bit about Henry Schein One and what Henry Schein One offers.
Perfect. So really briefly, when we start thinking about Henry Schein One, we're really part of a joint venture between Henry Schein and Internet Brands. So we're bringing a whole set of technology capabilities together from those two bigger parent companies. Obviously, we have a very strong footprint in practice management with brands like Dentrix and things like that. We also have a lot of experience and exposure with our PRM type products, patient relationship management, of which we have a variety of providers of those types of capabilities as well. And so a lot of the process of that integration work is, something that's top of mind for us. We want to simplify the integration challenges. Tom and I, we sit on some boards together, really talking about the challenges that face DSOs around just integrating technology. And so part of this joint venture is to start solving that problem. We're a global company. We have footprints all over the world. And so we continue to grow and expand. We have our eyes set on being the largest dental technology provider in the world, and we'll continue to go down that road. So this is a really, really great time to be focused in on that space. And so we're excited to see what we can do to really help practices out.
Oh, great. Thanks for the background, Dave. And I think, that's something we're going to talk about in this podcast because technology is pretty vast, right? I mean, so there in tech, what does that even mean? It means different things to different people. But let's talk a little bit about technology and how it relates to COVID. So kind of wanted to focus on back in March, mid-March, when practices started to close down or just remain open for essential dental care. Let's start with Tom. How did you as a CIO really deal with that situation, and how did you leverage technology? And you can use Eastern as an example, and then certainly some of the other organizations that you work with as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say this. It caught everybody by surprise, right? I remember kind of sitting in late January, early February, it was kind of, COVID was a thing, the international audience here was a lot more prevalent, not so much in the States. And it was like, okay, I don't think we'll really get to that point. But come March, we saw a pretty rapid decline pretty quickly when the states started, having these stay-at-home orders and shutdowns. The very first thing that we actually saw happen, which was very interesting, is because there was a lot of guidance coming out from local dental boards, as well as the ADA and things like that, trying to what to do. So the initial reaction was there was a lot of panic, right? A lot of my clients, they didn't know what to do. It was, well, are people going to come? What are we going to do? So on the technology side of it, what we actually did, we were utilizing technology to really look at what did we see as a decline of what was happening. We started running analytics and metrics after the first week of March into the second week of March to see really what was the patient no-show rate and cancellation rate. And then basically what that allowed the operations folks to do was to really take a look and say, okay, here's where the trends are going. And then by the time the shutdown orders really kind of came into effect, which was really the middle of the month, they had some good solid data to really make some of those decisions. And we really were using data analytics to drive those decisions to decide, when you're in a multi-group practice, right, it's a little different than when you're a solo dentist. A solo dentist, if they shut their doors, it's their entire revenue stream. In a group practice DSO, you have a little bit of flexibility where you could say, okay, I may have multiple practices in the same geographic area. So instead of having 3 or 4 or 5 of them open, maybe I'll go down to 1 or 2. And that was really what was done in the really early on of really running that data to see where were the patients comfortable coming in and where could you realign them so you could kind of shrink the footprint temporarily. And that was really what we started doing in March until really through May and into the beginning parts of June. But March is where that really started.
Yeah, so and you were able to do that, and so did that also help as far as how many people you actually even scheduled from an HR standpoint? What
Yeah.
dentists were, or
Yeah, it
hygienists and
actually was
assistants?
staffing levels, right? So basically, in a pretty large distributed scale, what we tend to see is this was before some of the government furloughs and loans and stuff like that came out. We really just had to look at what was the patient volume versus what was the chair capacity and what could we do with how many people, right? And then it really became a big math equation of, for X amount of people that had to kind of stay employed and stay on the books on a regular basis, how much patient volume were we able to accommodate versus how much you couldn't. And then that was a very ebb and flow type of, it was very variable. It was something that data had to be looked at pretty much almost on a daily basis for a while, and then more on a weekly basis to make those types of executive decisions from a financial perspective.
Really interesting, Dave. So as far as what Tom was dealing with, I mean, what were you seeing across all of your client base? I'm sure it varied state to state, but I mean, is that similar? I mean, was there anything that stood out? And then how did Henry Schein One and really working with Dentrix Enterprise, how were you able to kind of assist these DSOs? Because really, and they, it's thrown around a lot, right? Unprecedented, but it really was. Nobody's ever experienced this before. So, how were you able to take, maybe even measure data that you really never looked at before, or had to look at before? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that was a huge advantage is that we have such a broad variety of portfolios that we were able to tap into data to help customers make decisions as well. And I wouldn't say that we were driving the same types of analytics, although they were pulling it out of our systems in a lot of scenarios, as Tom can attest. But I think what really became interesting is, after the supposed 2-week vacation that people thought they were going to get that just never stopped coming, people started getting a lot more serious about trying to figure out what the new paradigm was going to look like. And, I think one of the primary concerns, as they started swinging back open was really around patient communication and the importance of getting people back in the door and comfortable and identifying the ADA best practices and how are you going to implement those. And, there were a lot of, behind the scenes conversations between all levels of expertise. Some of the client base for Dentrix Enterprise is a little unique because although we support a large number of DSOs, we also support a large number of health centers. And so the health centers, they saw very different behavior during COVID, because almost all of their patients are emergency patients. I mean, there's a lot of different things happening there. And so we ended up seeing a lot of maturity in the health center space around documentation, because they know that at some point in the future, they're going to want to know, we lost these patients due to COVID, and we want to come back and report on that later, either for future grants or future, protections or funding or any of those other things. So we started seeing people really start to mature the way that they wanted to track and manage how they're breaking appointments, what was happening with those appointments, what was the impact from a financial and from a velocity standpoint. And so those are some of those kind of bigger areas. What I thought was super telling was, and I really tip my hat to a lot of our customers, because they really went to work and they came up with really great conclusions. And I'd sit on a call with somebody who's on the East Coast and jump off that call and jump on with somebody who's on the West Coast, and they're all coming to the same conclusions, almost independent of each other. And I almost wish there was more conversation at a community level. That was one thing that was a huge takeaway for me was, we weren't set up to talk to each other from a practice to practice. Now, if you have a relationship, they were calling each other, but I mean, I'm still having, people that are operationally focused reaching out saying, how are you handling this? How are you saying no to, patients with COVID symptoms? And so there's a lot of new, what I would call the new norms, right? The new operating procedures that people are still navigating, and they have best practices, but I think it's still becoming a little bit sharper as people are realizing, hey, I need to get back to a new norm, and this new level of performance is different than it was pre-COVID. And so we're still looking at optimizing in those categories.
Good.
Yeah, I
That
wanted
leads.
to,
Go ahead,
okay.
Tom.
No, I was going to say something I want to tack on to what David said. He hit the nail on the head. What we really saw, and I know we were focusing more on the beginning of COVID, but as COVID kind of wound down, and I don't want to use that word lightly because I know we're seeing some flare-ups in some areas again recently, the process changed. It's a very different process of just from an intake process of how you're processing a patient coming in that door as we sit here, in the middle of July versus what was going on in January or February, right? A lot of my clients really got to, the days of where you don't have 30 or 40 people or 10 people sitting in the waiting room anymore, right? They're waiting out in their cars, and they really had to utilize technology, may it be through the, as David mentioned, the practice outreach and the tools. There's various tools that are out there to do that, be it the text messaging or, things like that to say, hey, I'm ready to check in now and come in. One of the biggest things actually that was interesting, and David probably attested to this, one of the number one requests I had from all my clients pre-COVID was, we want to go to more online check-in and kiosk-based check-in models in a lot of dental practices. Now, everyone's taking the kiosks out. I get, every day we're getting work orders of, put a plastic bag around that and take that out. And everybody wants to be able to do automatic check-in and things on personal devices, to keep it more low touch. So really the process is just dramatically changed. And usually in this space, that's something you see over a period of years. And we saw this happen over a period of weeks, to be quite frank.
Really interesting. So that leads to the question. You started to answer it already, Tom, but as far as, reopening. So I'm mostly all the practices, if not all the practices in the country, have reopened to some degree. Hopefully most of them are completely reopened. I know, and this California is shutting some things down, although dentistry doesn't sound like one of them yet, which is good, which is great to hear. But tell me a little bit about reopening process. And I think a lot of it has to do with scheduling. So you had a bunch of patients that for a month and a half, 2 months, were on the books to come in for recall. All of a sudden, they're canceled. So how did you handle that, Tom?
Yeah, that was an interesting topic, right? I saw this actually, and believe it or not, this was a little different depending on the region of where you lived, right? I would say the Northeast handled this a little bit different than the South and the middle part of the country, because what we saw is we kind of saw staggered opening times that was going around, similar to how we saw staggered close times. I think the commonality, though, is what we saw is that basically in a multifaceted practice, the number one thing that did not happen during COVID was what they would call, non-elective and hygiene type procedures. Those were pretty much universally shut down throughout the country in most of the area from what we saw. So we were seeing the more routine and emergency dental procedures. And even though a lot of the practices were still open for emergency care during COVID, there was months of backlog from that kind of 2.5 month shutdown. So during the reopening process, it really was, again, using data to say, okay, what type of appointments need to be rescheduled and what has to come in first, second, and third, and how much chair time, can be allocated to it. The other thing too, which was a real struggle in the dental industry, some of my colleagues on the medical side and stuff, this was a little easier, is dental was never used to acquiring PPE. This was something that was a shock to the system. So that actually was a factoring into the reopening of saying how much PPE could a practice or a group get, and then how could they stagger that to be able to do certain types of procedures, and kind of it all had to kind of be melded together. And I don't think anyone had a perfect science of it. It was really kind of a day by day, week by week, figuring out what works best depending on the region.
Yeah, great point on the PPE, and it's still, I mean, to be determined, right? That's, I think the masks seem to be less of a shortage. I've heard some rumors on gloves, and then of course there's, aerosol management, which isn't PPE, but it's something that maybe wasn't quite as top of mind as it is now. So yeah, all those types of things are really interesting. Dave, let's talk a little bit about, again, reopening. Let's focus on that. So we talked about, help technology and how it helped assist with closing, and then handling emergency only. But what did you see as far as, was scheduling a big deal? Was that a primary focus when you reopened, or what types of technologies were used, and did that vary geographically? Because it sounds like with Tom, it certainly did.
Yeah, I would say scheduling was probably one of the biggest drivers of just trying to figure out how to get an appointment book back on track, right? And I think for a lot of, it was that challenge of finding people that were willing to come back in, as, combined with the backlog. So you've got a pent up demand of people that all want to come back. And then, but some of them are not quite ready because they wanted to be warmed up to coming back in. Meaning, are you following best practices? Are you using good, safe procedures and some of those things? And I think it took some time for people to kind of build up that confidence again. And I would say, nationally, I think the confidence is pretty good, because we're starting to see more solidified numbers across the board, right? But I would say, people respect dentists as being, medical provider and having deep expertise. And it was one of those areas where, you're trusting them to make good decisions on your behalf. And it's that trade-off between private public, where you're going out, some people hadn't left their homes for weeks. And now you're thinking, oh, I'm going to go, my first place I'm going to go is the dentist, So I think there's some trepidation with that on top of it. So I think those were, from a technological standpoint, what was really challenging. And I find this for a lot of the practices we talked to, it was knowing which of the patients to get queued up and which ones not. And I think it was a really hard fought battle for a lot of practices trying to get that sorted out. It was a lot of phone time. For a lot of the practices I've talked to, they did a lot of, they ran their emails and their text messages. But at the end of the day, the ones that were filling their books fastest were the ones also picking up the phone and helping people feel comfortable with getting back in. So it was a really multifaceted strategy to make those decisions. And I think that's one of those areas where, from a technological standpoint, we learned a lot of lessons as a technology creator. We looked at that and we thought, wow, we need to do a better job in some of these categories, because, being able to pivot and change things on the fly was really challenging. And even right now, we're seeing customers, they're challenged with still juggling around their appointment book schedules. Like, how often is this operatory going to be open? Are we going to be open for 10 hours today? Are we going to be open for 12 hours today? Are we going to be open for 6? And I think there's some debate about, what the right balance is and how many providers do you want in a single operatory. And so you're starting to see people really shift those loads around to get back to normal capacity levels. And it's there's a lot of creativity right now. From scheduling standpoint, I think it's still ongoing. I think that it'll be for the next couple months.
This ties in. You're talking about making patients feel comfortable to come in, and then But what about and were groups leveraging technology for this? Because talked to a lot of groups, the issue wasn't just patients. It was also employees.
Yeah.
How comfortable did they feel coming in? So you may have had the patient buy-in, but some of the employees weren't comfortable for whatever reason from a safety standpoint, or maybe they were making more money on unemployment, so they weren't coming in. So did you, was there employee communication issues, or was that something that was helpful in leveraging technology that way?
That was really unique across the relationships between providers and their staff, or the DSOs and their staff. And it was really interesting because I talked to some that they basically said, hey, come back, and everybody came back. And then I talked to others that was like, you're coming back or you're not coming back. So it was a little bit more of the ultimatum. We've got to get back to work. And so it's very interesting you bring that up, because from a global, national perspective, it really came back to having great relationships. And I think that dentistry is built on great relationships. It's the relationship between the staff and the patients, and the provider and the patients, and the provider and their staff. And I think those are something that, when you look at that in the big picture, I don't think we could measure that as much as we're seeing now, where people are, that was dictating how fast people were coming back. And I think it's a very interesting kind of a sign around, how important good relationships can be, in a business context.
Yeah, it was just very interesting. To your point, it probably had a lot to do with culture of the DSO or the group relationships, but and communication as well.
Depended on where you lived. It depended on where you lived, because you had different states were a little bit more liberal on people coming back with regulations and stuff. So there was definitely a lot of regionalization to that going on.
Yep, that makes a ton of sense. I know that there's some DSOs I talk to that still are short staffed because people haven't come back for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about, do you think, and again, we talked a little bit about this, and go back to Tom, challenges during reopening. I mean, what have you seen? And again, maybe put this more into technology. I mean, we're not going to take technology out of it, but what are the biggest challenges you're seeing now? Like today, if you had to say, hey, these are the couple of things we're still struggling with at the DSOs I work with, what would you say those would be?
I think the biggest thing out of the ones that I work with that's kind of been uniform across the board, in addition to the scheduling like we had talked about, I think is really for them trying to keep a cadence going of forecasting. I think that goes for forecasting not only from the scheduling side and the financial side of the house, but also what their spend is. We're seeing a lot of ups and downs because of, their supply changes and things like that too. But I think their biggest challenge is really understanding, okay, we might be okay for this week or this month, but how fast is the ramp going to be? Because at least in the bulk of my clients, and Dave may have a different perspective, I don't think anybody could say they're at 100% pre-COVID levels. Maybe in the medical space and the ones that are more health clinics, that might be the case, because they actually are probably above 100% of pre-COVID levels in that public health sector. But in the private side of the house and in the DSO side of the house, nobody's at 100%, right? So I think that the big question everybody has is, okay, how long is it going to take to get from 70% or 80% back to 95 or 100? And what does that new 100 really look like? Because I think there's some question out there of, is the new normal the same 100% of what it was in the past normal? Because there's economics to that, not only from a financial perspective, just difference in sterilization techniques. And an example in the state of New Jersey, they have limited the amount of time that you have to have between patients in the operatories for aerosols to dissipate and things like that. So that's having an impact on overall time frame. So I think the big question and the big struggle everybody's asking now is, yes, things will return to normal and people and staff will come back, but what does that ramp look like? Because right now it's kind of a paper exercise, but there's no tried and true method. And I think that's the number one angst. If I were to ask any of the, CEOs or any of the executives of the larger DSOs, they're like, I just can't tell you how quick the ramp's going to be because it's very fluid.
Really interesting. Yeah. So what does 100% really mean? What does it look like? Is it different procedure mix? What do our margins look like? Is it more patients? Or is
it more patients? Is it less patients? Is it, how does it all tie together? And I think that's what everybody's trying to understand.
Yeah. And I would agree with that, Tom, almost 100%. I mean, it, for me, the more structured and more organized, the faster they got to a certain level. But, when I talk to different practices and I ask them, where are you guys at from a claims volume, from a production perspective? The ones that I'm talking to, they're hitting that kind of low 90s mark. And that kind of feels like their new norm for a while. And, when we're talking about it, we're thinking maybe into December. We might be at that stage where that's kind of the new norm and until things really change for the environment. And so I'm kind of seeing, if you're a best of breed DSO and you want to know if how you're benchmarking. Now, depending on state and depending on region, you guys know that it's very different. But, consistently the ones that I felt like are doing the best, they're in that low 90s, production rate compared to what they were before. And so you've got to think about, well, what do we want to do? How do we want to make up that difference? Or do we want to have a change in staff strategy? Do we want to have a change in provider strategy? Do we want to have longer operatory hours to kind of get those, how do we want to leverage those investment assets that we have? And, those are the types of conversations that I'm hearing more and more on. Do we want an additional provider and then do evening work to get to those numbers, right? And so it's starting to be those types of trade-offs that I think people are trying to figure out. But yeah, when I look across the sea of practices that I've talked to and interview, I would agree with Tom. I mean, they're ramping. They hit that 70, 80 mark, and then they really start to plateau up in those low 90s. And those are the best ones. I mean, that's where we're kind of seeing it. So, if I was out there, if I was a DSO and I had questions about, if I'm not hitting that, then I'm going to start asking myself some hard questions about what are we doing and what do we need to do to get to those levels. But that kind of feels like the new norm for at least for the next few months, as people are kind of sorting it out.
So that's the benchmark. Well, let's talk a little bit about. I'll throw this at you again, Dave. So this is as far as DSOs versus solos. Do you feel, and then Tom, you can answer this as well. I mean, do you think DSOs are positioned better to recover more quickly, whatever that means, quickly? But you really I kind of look at the solos, and you kind of think of what kind of infrastructure do they really have, if any? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, do DSOs have an advantage? I mean, are they gonna recover more quickly? Are solos maybe going to struggle a little bit more, and maybe will that add to, if so, will that add to maybe the acceleration of the consolidation in the industry?
Ooh, that's a loaded set of questions all combined together. Let me tackle a couple of them.
I ask you the tough ones.
The first one was, do I think that DSOs have an advantage? In this context, they absolutely have an advantage. I mean, they have better visibility into what they're doing on merch. They have better visibility into what they're doing on performance metrics across locations. They know which locations were going to be stronger than others, which ones I reopen faster than others. If you're a solo practice, you kind of get what you've got and you turn it on and you hope for the best. But where I feel like for a lot of the DSOs, they could ramp very strategically back up and going after the lifeblood, locations that were just, higher performing, brings them to a different level of profitability right out of the gate. So I think there's some definite advantages in some of the data and analytics that they've put in place. Not that solo practices don't do any analytics, but I do find that a lot of the more sophisticated DSOs, they spend a lot more time looking at, they slicing and dicing their data to make good decisions there. As far as, where do I think it goes? Do I think it's going to accelerate the consolidation? I think people are going to pause and take a look, because what we were doing for valuations of practices before is not going to be the same going forward. It's a lot harder to decide if that's a good practice or a bad practice, because you might be in a more risky environment. And, I was talking to an organization the other day. They just acquired a practice from another DSO, and And part of their rationale was it was easier for them to support it because it was closer to their region where they have a core infrastructure to support them. So the regional DSOs, I think, are going to do better because they know their states, their infrastructure, their limitations better. Some of the national ones are, I don't know how they're going to see it because we're just not seeing the same type of M&A activity that we saw, pre-COVID. Lots of talks. I'm not seeing a lot of trigger pulling. And so I think that's going to be something that we're going to have to determine. I mean, there are those advantages that come from, bigger organizations. They tend to weather storms a little bit better. And so you start to see some of those, I don't know, tailwinds kind of pushing that way. But as of right now, nobody's getting out and nobody's shutting down. So, and now we're hoping people keep that way. We want to keep everybody employed and going. And I think that's going to be something that we'll just start to see over the next few months if M&A starts really kind of ramping back up.
Well, Tom, I'll let you answer that question as well. It's just as far as, or do you think DSOs are positioned better? But then I'll add this to it. What data are you looking at right now as a CIO? Because really if we figure DSOs may recover more quickly, if that's the theory, is it because they have access to data that maybe is out there, but the solos just aren't analyzing, right? They just don't have the bandwidth to do it, or they don't have a CIO that knows what to look at.
It's a little different, right? And I think I'd answer the question maybe a little bit differently than David did because I'm actually pretty involved in the M&A market. What we're actually seeing now in kind of post-COVID is we're seeing a little bit of a downturn, a lot of a downturn of I'll say the aggressive DSOs that were kind of the ultra non-conservative ones that were in a buy mode that you saw before that. That's definitely slowed down. But what we're seeing now is a ton of debt consolidation. And it's an interesting topic because I work very closely with a lot of vendors and firms that do a lot of debt consolidation and debt reconstruction. One of the big things is you kind of have three different models in the DSO space, right? You've got your private equity-backed DSOs, you've got your private-backed DSOs, which is just private money, and then you got your solo guys who, it's eat what you kill, they own it all. So depending on where you fell in that timeline, and it kind of goes to your question of looking at the data, everyone was impacted differently. Some of your solo guys and people who had private money may have qualified for PPP money from the government during the shutdown. So they weathered the storm a little bit better on the financial side. Some of your mid-size and larger DSOs that were private equity backed may not have qualified for those loans. So they were burning through cash at a much more rapid pace during the shutdown. So what we're seeing now is, we haven't seen anybody completely fold, but we've seen a lot of divestitures where certain groups may have split into multiple groups and things like that in order to offload some of that debt load. And where we kind of look at the data points of this, it really comes down to looking at, it goes back to ramp, right? I think that it really looks at, what type of procedures, how many procedures and quality of care, because everyone's taking a real good look at quality of care and trying to overlay that data of, what those numbers look like is really, really driving that. And unfortunately, some of the bigger guys are actually struggling a little bit more with that because they have a little bit more debt that they've got to distribute around versus some of the smaller guys might be a little bit more nimble and be able to do that. So it's kind of a mixed bag of what you're seeing out there right now.
Okay. It's interesting. I mean, I guess we'll find out more as we get towards the end of the year, right? How things progress as far as who survives and who doesn't, or who thrives, I should say, and who doesn't. All right, so we're going to get away from COVID. Okay, so no more COVID talk, but let's talk a little bit about something exciting. So, what type of new technologies are on the horizon? I'll throw this at Dave first, and then Tom can finish up. But what are you guys developing in Henry Schein One? What are you excited about? Like what's the, we hear a lot about AI, if you want to talk about that, but just in general, what's going on that you guys are like, hey, this is going to be something that's going to be a game changer, is going to help out. And again, nothing COVID related.
Yeah. I think there's definitely a springboarded interest in capabilities around no-touch environments. Tom alluded to this earlier. What once was a kiosk-driven concept is now becoming a virtual waiting room type of a concept. I think we're going to continue to see innovation all the way through that patient experience. I think we'll continue to innovate and see changes that are, I think it's going to be low touch to no touch types of scenarios, or touch your own device type of scenarios. I think we're going to continue to see evolution in that front, at least for the foreseeable future. There's a lot of interest in AI technology. I'm glad you hit that one. Right now, one of the challenges is that AI is expensive to develop, and it's a challenging balancing act of figuring out what types of AI are going to create the most value for practices. My argument right now is that I forecast a lot more automation. I think a lot more rules-based decision-making is on its way. I think that we're going to see a lot of offloading of human decisions to machine decisions, and then go back and kind of review and say, hey, was that the right choice? Kind of in a more of a spot checking type of environment. I think that we'll see more interaction technology. I continue to see that happening right now. One of the things I think that we'll see over the next calendar year is there's going to be a movement towards shrinking the amount of time that it takes for providers to put data into the system. I think that you'll continue to see more headway in, voice input, or smarter ways of inputting data from the chart into the software. I think there's going to be a lot of innovation in those types of categories, because that provider time is going to become it was important before, it's gold now. And I think that's going to be one of those areas where, people are really going to have to focus in on, we want to minimize the amount of time that we're touching software in general. So I think we'll continue to see a lot of areas in those categories where we're really starting to push that automation area. And I think those are going to be some big wins, particularly for DSOs as they scale. The better the automation, the more profitable they become. And I think that's going to be a big push for them.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Tom, last word on this. What are you excited about from the technology perspective?
Yeah, I think what excites me the most is I think we're finally going to see some process flow changes, right? Dental historically has always been a little late to the game with technology adoption. And when I'll phrase that with, you look at the evolution of practice management systems versus where the EMR bubble was, medical always went first, right? They were behind financial services and other industries. And then dental would kind of always be in the rear. What I think we're starting to see now is that the processes have to change. And I think that dental is uniquely positioned to actually do that a little bit quicker, because at the end of the day, the type of procedures that you're doing in dental are not necessarily changing, but you have to work a little bit smarter, a little bit more efficiently, and with less. So things that used to be kind of, dragging people by the hair of, hey, Mr. Provider, I used to do this way for 20 years, and now try to get them to change that has always been a struggle. That's always been a struggle as a CIO role to get, operational change. And I think what we're seeing now is operational change is a must. And I think that they're willing to embrace the technology to help accelerate that at a much more rapid pace than they were, years ago. And not even talking about COVID, just in general, we're kind of seeing a paradigm shift in the industry that they're realizing that to be more efficient, you have to embrace that. And I think we're going to see a lot of workflow management tools that are really going to help, kind of take off some of that decision-making authority and make it a little bit more automated going forward to make people's lives easier.
Great. Well, that's good news and certainly exciting. I would just love to see more dentists embrace online scheduling. I mean, we haven't even gotten there yet. So,
Yeah.
but this is good stuff. Listen, guys. Thanks again for joining us today. Dave, thank you from Henry Schein One. Tom, thank you. Think forward, and we really, the audience, I think, will get a lot out of this, and can't wait to have you both back on when COVID's over and we're past the new normal and back to normal.
Sounds good. Thank you, Bill. Pleasure.
All right, thanks again, guys. Until next time, I'm Bill Newman, Group Dentistry Now.
The Group Dentistry Now show has listeners across North and South America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. If you like our show, subscribe today and please tell your colleagues about us.